Welcome to JustWannaQuilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Townsend-Gard. I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School, and I just wanna quilt. Today we're talking to Pamela Johnson. She is a quilt artist. She sells some of her stuff, but she doesn't see herself as a professional quilt artist, which is super interesting. She comes by way of a colleague, Hope O'Keefe, at the Library of Congress. Thanks, Hope, and I hope you enjoy the interview. I really found it fascinating what she does and how she sees herself in the quilting world. Hi, Pam. So this is Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being willing to chat. I thought what we would chat about today is art quilts and sort of what it means to be an artist that does art quilts and all things art quilt related. Does that sound like a reasonable way to go?
That's okay.
Okay, cool. So first tell me, I already said your name, but officially we say tell me who you are and where you are. And then I'll ask the first question.
I'm in the far western part of Massachusetts. We are very close to the New York border, and we're very close to the Connecticut border. And it's an area called the Berkshires, which is very much a cultural resort area in the summer and ski area in the winter. So that's where I am, living on a private lake, sitting on 5 acres of partially landscaped woodland. And those woodland plants have been an inspiration for quite a lot of my quilts.
Yeah, your quilts
So I am a keen gardener.
Yeah, your quilts are beautiful. They really are. They're so beautiful. So tell us about, what we always start with one question, which is what's your first memory of someone sewing?
Oh, as a small child. My mother sewed, but my next door neighbor, I was born in 1944. So growing up in the immediate post-war period when everybody had to make do in England, my next door neighbor was a professional seamstress, and she worked for a small shop that made clothes for people back in the days when, that's how people got their clothing. And so she taught me to sew on her treadle sewing machine. And I was very, very interested in fashion, and she would bring me the cards that they got at the store that were sent, which were the patterns coming up for new designs coming out of Paris. And I spent a great deal of time drawing well into my teenage years, basically designing, so I thought, clothing. And I learned to sew, I can't remember, probably 9 years old. And then I went on to not only sew my own clothes, but also to embroider and knit and so on.
That's really cool. And how did you get into art quilting? That didn't happen until later. Did you do art in school? Was that something that you focused on at all?
Yes. In the English system, you take all the general subjects at the age of 16, in my day, and you take those are called ordinary level, and then you pick 3 subjects for advanced level. And I, not understanding about careers and things like that, picked the things that I was interested in. So I did English, art, and biology. So it was almost as if I, ticked one in every column. So I studied art, and that included history of art, but also painting and drawing and design for the stage was one of the major things that we did. So I had that, I had that training up immediately before university. But I did not do any drawing or painting for a very long time. My career was in the computer industry, and that's what brought me to the United States in 1980. And because I was on my own and living in a hotel until my house was ready, I was looking around for things to do, and so I looked for an evening course. But they'd already, were a month into the start of the year. So the only things that were available that hadn't yet started were Chinese cooking and quilting. So I took both of those and learned to quilt using those, the kind of fabrics that were available then, all the, rather brightly colored patterned things.
Right.
But learning to do it by hand with templates and so on. I had, I'd made, maybe I'd made a sample. I made a sample bed quilt. We did, a different technique for each square in it. My secretary was pregnant, and she was ill and had to be lying prone for several weeks. And so she said, "Oh, I'm getting so bored." And I said, "Well, you're arty. Why don't you put together some ideas for the kind of baby quilt you'd like?" So I was thinking, traditional quilt. She came back with a picture of Jiminy Cricket under a mushroom and said, "I'd like that." So I thought, well, okay. I think I can draw that, and then I think I can figure out how to make it. And so that was my first venture out of the world of, geometric printing, quilting, and the sort of formulaic way of doing things. And so I created a quilt for her with Jiminy Cricket, and I had shoes were padded, and there was some trapunto in the mushroom, and so on. I'm sure we shouldn't have done that. I think Disney owned the rights, but anyway, that was done.
It's all fine. There's personal use, right? You weren't selling it, so it was.
No, it was,
so yeah. Well, that's really
so that
interesting.
Was the first.
Did you feel like you had to figure out techniques to make that very first one? Imagine, imagine you kind of had to improv how to make this thing.
Yes, it was. I worked in engineering. This was not rocket science. It was just, it was really quite straightforward. And then I went on to make quilts for other friends who were having babies, but it was always doing something that was creating images that were relevant to them. And not traditional. Then we actually went to see, both my husband and I have great interest in art and have always gone to, art museums and so on. And we went to an exhibition of art quilts in Boston and absolutely loved them. And this was actually before we got married. And when we got married, our staff wanted to buy us a gift, and one of the wives was an artist and had been with us to this exhibition. And so she thought, I think they'd like an art quilt. And so she talked to various prominent quilters about their willingness to undertake the commission. And Ruth McDowell said that she would. But she said, you could get an introduction to my work by going to a show I have opening in Lexington, which is the next town over from us. And we went to it, and the signature piece from the show suited us perfectly, and we said, we don't need to commission something, we'll buy this one, please. And so we bought the Ruth quilt, which is pretty large, and since then have had to continue to have houses with cathedral ceilings so that there's a space for the quilt.
That's really great.
And so subsequently I took classes with Ruth. Twice I took a week-long study program.
With her.
So the technique I use is very much largely based on Ruth's technique, which suits me very well, you know, that engineering background. And of course she went to MIT.
Interesting.
So we've got something in common there as to what suits us.
That's very interesting. You know, I've been doing these interviews, and I can't tell you how many times people have an engineering background and that they're drawn to quilting. It's really, I mean, it makes sense, but it is a common theme, which is really interesting. And looking at your work, which is, again, beautiful, you wouldn't think, like, I think people think of engineers as someone who, like, straight lines, you know, building kind of thing, kind of cold. And your stuff is anything but that. It's filled with beautiful flowers and all kinds of other things. And how do you see on your art quilts, what role does the engineering part of your brain play?
Well, in order to create those images in fabric, I see it as sort of a combination of my, you know, engineering orientation and my art orientation. I actually studied botanical illustration at New York Botanical Gardens for 2 years. And so that comes into play as well, because when I am looking at a subject, I use photographs, but I also very often use drawings, because with a drawing you get to better understand how leaves attach to the stem, exactly what's going on around the flower, and so on. And so that comes into play. The engineering part comes into play is that you have to create a plan for it in such a way that you can sew it together without ending up with bits that you can't, you know, fiddly bits, you know, sort of like jigsaw puzzle pieces.
Right. And
so even though it's hidden, I can show people when they see a quilt in the flesh, as it were, in the fabric, I can show them how it's done. But the process goes from the inspiration, photographs, drawings, detailed drawings, and so on, into me making a freehand drawing of the whole thing, and then turning that into a schematic. And the schematic is full of lines. Some of them are all done with straight lines, some are done with curved. The straight-lined ones are harder to lay out the design in a way that makes it look not artificial when it's sewn. The curved ones are easier to draw and obviously harder to sew. So you make a complete drawing of the whole thing with all of the seam lines in, and everything numbered, and understanding the order in which you will put it together, and then copy the whole thing over onto freezer paper to create templates, and putting registration marks on every single line, so that once you've cut pieces out, you can put them back together. So it's a very detailed planning process in terms of creating that template